Hi, my name is Peter Bergen. I'm Vice President at New America. It's a great pleasure to introduce Jeff Stone, whose new book, The Warhead, The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare, is just out. Jeff has had a distinguished career as a journalist and author. He's published 5 books, including The 1517 to Paris, which was adapted as a major motion picture by Clint Eastwood. And he spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, which is how I have got to know him. He's been named a graduate fellow at the Stanford Center on the International Conflict and Negotiation, and has been a grantee of the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, and The Atlantic. So, Jeff, congratulations on your new book, and I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us kind of some of the big stories and big themes of the book, and then we'll engage you. I'll engage you in Q&A, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. If you do have a question in the audience, you can put it into the Slido app, and I will feed those questions to Jeff. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for joining. This book kind of came out of a New York Times Magazine article that was really just focused on finding a way to get people to care about what was happening in Yemen, which is a conflict that I had learned about way late. Considering liking to consider myself someone who's relatively informed about what's going on in the world, the conflict in Yemen was one that, despite how, or maybe because of how massive the crisis was, didn't seem to be really resonating here. And so, with some editors, we were looking for a way um, to try to bring it home to readers. And one of the ideas we came up with was following a bomb used in an airstrike there, kind of the other way from the American factory in Arizona to where it was shipped to Saudi Air Base to ultimately dropped over Yemen. And in the process of researching that particular bomb, we learned, I had never known this, that it was invented, this particular guided bomb was invented by Texas Instruments, which of course I always thought of as the calculator company. Um, and when after that article came out, and we began talking about a way to do that kind of at book length, the idea kind of evolved into, first of all, just the history of this particular weapon, because it's relatively inexpensive, it's ostensibly very precise, and its iterations of it are used in almost every conflict in which we use air power, starting in Vietnam. But also because this is a weapon that is kind of a tool of disconnection, both in a very literal bodily sense, but also in that it's really allowed the kind of remote in each iteration of further remove in terms of like remote warfare, trying to use it as kind of a tool of connection in the book. So both telling stories of the invention of this weapon and the evolution and how it sort of grows from Paveway 1 to Paveway 2 to GPS to bunker busters. Also showing how it is allowing each further iteration of ever more remote warfare, but also connecting it to individual stories of people who, pilots who used it, people who had it used against them, people who protested its use, and trying to tell almost kind of a narrative history of what may be considered kind of the Pax Americana from, roughly the end of World War II to the last maybe decade or so. So that's the ambition, sort of a nonfiction human novel with a military history running through it. And in the process of putting these stories together, one of the things that was not necessarily a thesis starting out, but became kind of ever more clear as one of the main thrusts of the book is the idea that the trigger can pull the finger. That if if you have a invention, a weapon that is good enough, ostensibly humane enough, precise enough, it can begin to argue for its own use. And one of the examples that I often use in discussion to sort of illustrate that is the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the second Gulf War, which was often called the most precise air war in history. And by proportion of precision munitions used, I think that's accurate. But there's also statistics about the number of civilians killed, and some of them, the measurements are kind of all over the place. We don't necessarily have a definitive figure, but some of the most sort of esteemed publications that were tracking civilian casualties have essentially more civilians killed in Iraq within 6 months or a year than were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined in what was called the most precise air war ever. So this idea that you can do a lot of damage with ostensibly precise weapons, I think in part because they provide not just a tactical and strategic solution, but kind of a political one too. We can go places and engage in strikes, both because it's easier, it takes fewer people, fewer man and materials, but also because we can tell ourselves it's precise, we can tell ourselves it's inexpensive, we can tell ourselves it's going to only hit the terrorist and not the civilian nearby. And to a large extent, that's true, but it also allows these interventions, which we perhaps wouldn't have engaged in had we not had this weapon. So that's one of the kind of themes running through it. I think another one is I think it's sort of easy to think of people who invent weapons as the sort of James Bond villains, and in this case, the people who are building the weapon, who are inventing it, are kind of, to a man and woman, really humane, interesting, interested engineers who are solving problems, who are thinking not of who they're hurting, but of the pilots that they're saving, of even the civilians that they're saving by inventing a weapon that's precise enough that it can lower civilian casualties, less collateral damage. And I think to a large extent that has been the legacy of the bomb. But then, of course, we have used it in a lot of cases where we may not have intervened. And also, no matter how precise a weapon is, it's only as precise as the intelligence. And because we're often using weapons like this in places where we don't necessarily have a lot of intelligence on the ground, you can't you can't precisely hit a target if you don't know who's there. If you don't have good human intel on, are these the bad guys? Are these the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? And so there's been a lot of cases where the lack of really good intelligence on the ground has led to catastrophe. So anyway, this is sort of the framing of the book, trying to tell a history of this weapon as a way to tell a history of modern war, but also trying to connect people, because as this weapon has proliferated and kind of removed people from war, because increasingly it kind of looks like a video game. It's a kid in an air conditioned trailer at Creech Air Force Base hitting a button. The screen looks like infrared readout. It's pixels. It's not people. So trying to bring people back in by telling kind of full color, 360-degree personal narratives of the people kind of on every side of this. So that's my book report.
Well, so tell us a little bit more about sort of the technical details of, you call it the Warhead. What do you mean by that?
So the Warhead refers to this one weapon called Paveway, and the weapon was invented in the 60s and first deployed in conflict in Vietnam. And there had been a long legacy of trying to get weapons to steer on their own, with varying degrees of success. There had really not been a weapon that was reliably effective until Paveway. One of the reasons was because Texas Instruments, when they were working on this, was really not a defense contractor. They were kind of the upstart kind of electronics nerds who didn't belong. And they weren't given a lot of leeway, and they weren't given a lot of money. And part of what they ended up having to do was kind of bootstrap these prototypes by taking a piece off that weapon and a piece off that weapon. And they were kind of forced to invent something that was cheap and simple, fewer moving parts. So one example of this is when the idea to have a weapon steered by laser, have a photon sensor on the tip of a weapon that can sense when it's going off target and send a message back to fins, steer left because we're moving off target this way, steer right. There was a problem of how you get the photon sensor to keep looking at the laser reflection. Because as a bomb falls through the air, it's wiggling that way, it's wobbling that way, it's losing sight. And the one of the primary ways the bigger defense contractors who were attacking this problem were trying to attack it was some kind of robotic head, some kind of motorized robotic head that would somehow steer itself independent of the bomb in order to keep itself like focused on laser reflection. The innovation that Texas Instruments came up with was um, using what's called a Gianni probe, which is used in aircraft to help the aircraft measure its angle of attack. It's essentially a badminton birdie that sticks out from the side and just stabilizes itself in the wind without any kind of additional motorized, independent motorized head. So Texas Instruments sort of stole this thing from an entirely different purpose, put it on the nose of the bomb, and kind of solved the problem with as few moving parts as possible. And that was one of the reasons why this thing was more effective and cheaper. Um, because it was because it was cheaper and more effective, it was taken up much quicker than some of these other weapons. And so the initial reports back from Vietnam when it was first used, the Air Force researchers were sort of breathless. We went from missing 90% of targets to hitting 90% of targets, and circular error probability, which is how they measured the accuracy of the bomb, went from 100 meters to 3 meters, something like this. And so, as successive conflicts, as we engage in successive conflicts, this became kind of the favorite weapon of the generals, of the ground crew, of the pilots, and through the last 50 or 60 years, it's been iterated on. So from Paveway 1 to Paveway 2, which flew a little bit better and had retractable wings, so it could glide further, to Paveway that could guide a bunker buster warhead to sort of steer it to make sure it was landing at the exact right angle of attack, to GPS, to weapons that can have different levels of detonation. So you can detonate it above a target, you can detonate it below a target, you can detonate it at a target, but it's still fundamentally the same weapon that was invented for Vietnam that is one of the most widely used precision weapons still. And the JDAMs and other weapons that have come on are I think you could call them kind of descendants of the legacy of this one weapon, Paveway.
Yeah, so I mean, I think people listening to this or watching this are probably familiar with the idea of dumb bombs and smart bombs. So what
Mm-hmm.
your book is then is really a history of smart bombs, which are supposed to be more accurate and obviously can reduce civilian casualty. I mean, it's not, I don't know what the percentage of, I mean, during World War II, obviously the United States dropped bombs on Dresden, destroyed the city.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, on the other hand, you mentioned the Iraq War, the American invasion was in 2003, and Azmat Khan, who's a former fellow at New America, and
Mm-hmm.
also an Anchor Pulp. I'm sure you're familiar with their work, but I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they um, they certainly found that the civilian casualty rate was much higher in
Mm-hmm.
Iraq than the Pentagon had said. And then it sort of gets into the question of drone warfare, which I don't know if you get to in your book, but this the idea that as things are more ac as bombs and missiles are more accurate, um, in a way they lower the threshold for their use because they
Mm-hmm.
seem to be. And
Right.
certainly, I think if you look at the post 9/11 era, I mean the first use of an armed drone was I think in October 7th, trying to kill Mullah
Mm-hmm.
Omar. But I mean, obviously, it's changed the face of warfare. So um, you implied this a little bit earlier that, but the use of these smarter weapons can encourage people to think that there's a more humane way of war. Is that the?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy. That it can look, and sometimes it can be more precise, but it's still exploding somewhere.
Yeah.
And it may look like a video game, but And there is, as probably nobody knows better than you, there is almost always some kind of blowback. Things don't blow up without, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It may take a month or 6 months, but it's very hard to blow something up without making somebody very angry. Um,
Yeah,
and I think to your point, about lowering the threshold for their use. And the other thing that's starting to happen now is tests with essentially supercomputers on armed drones that are able to collapse the kill chain down into essentially a few seconds and do it autonomously. And there's a Defense Department directive that says something like there will always be a meaningful level of human engagement in any decision to attack, or that's not exact, but something. I think the term is meaningful level of human engagement,
yeah,
which I don't know exactly what that means, and the explanation for why these drones are equipped with targeting computers that are able to work autonomously is just like in case they lose connection with whoever's steering them. But you can imagine that if you have an entire closed system that's saying, okay, private in a drone operating trailer in an Air Force base, the entire system, we've identified the terrorist, the drone is above, it's on station, the weapon is chosen, and you just have to decide whether you want to not strike. It's an immense amount of pressure. And I don't think there's I don't there's that many people who will have the confidence to say, let's just stop the entire system because I'm not sure. Um,
yeah. I mean, my impression is that the U.S. Air Force used to talk about these that there would be a human being, who would always be in the decision loop to make the
mhm.
decision to strike. And now I think they may have amended that slightly to say a human being on the loop, or
On the loop, right?
yeah. So so 10 plus years ago was the idea that a human being would have to make a kill decision. And I think that's still
Exactly.
the sort of stated US Air Force policy. But um, the technology is sort of leaving the policy behind, as is often the case. Um,
Right.
and the Chinese, I don't think, really care about this issue in any
Mhm.
meaningful way. And
Right.
just this weekend, you may have seen a piece by C.J. Chivers in the New York Times Magazine about sort of the Ukrainians developing autonomous drones. So, if you're in a war and you're not winning,
Mhm.
it just seems to me that unfortunately, this train has sort of left the station. And when I talk to some senior, retired U.S. Army folks, they tend to actually say, well, look, we're not planning to lose a war to the Chinese because of kind of
Right.
our
These
moral.
quaint.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I don't think they're being sort of totally cynical when they say that. I mean,
Hmm.
um, so, but your book is really about how this all came to be, the world that we live
Hmm.
in now.
Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I think a lot of the people making the policy and inventing the weapons, one of the kind of historical analogs that is not in the book, but I think of often is there's, when Niels Bohr visited the Manhattan Project, and there's this famous exchange where he says, is it big enough? And Oppenheimer says, to end the war. And Niels Bohr says, to end all war. And there was a similar exchange that Alfred Nobel had with some of his correspondents saying, the dynamite that my factories make will be so awful that countries will lay down their arms. And it's sort of it's understandable, and it's kind of a neat psychological trick, I think, to sort of describe inventing tools of destruction as actually tools of humanity. Of I'm inventing something that is either a tool of defense or is a tool of protection. And in this case, I'm inventing something that is going to save our pilots and also save civilians on the ground. And that's not totally false at all. But of course, it is still a weapon. It is still a weapon. And even once we had nuclear weapons that proliferated, we still had war. Arguably because of this weapon, because of a precise weapon that you could use and say, I'm going to strike this target and not the people next to it who might be, who might escalate this to a nuclear exchange. Um, so it's a
What,
bit of a. Go ahead.
and what about, I mean, the proliferation of this technology to other countries? I mean, I assume it's ubiquitous.
Yeah, I mean, we sell it to something like 30 or 40 countries, and then those that we don't have developed their own versions of it, of course. So, mm,
When you were reporting in Yemen, uh, when did you go and tell us about the process and what that was like?
that was early 2018, I think, um, and we're focusing on one particular airstrike in North Yemen in a town called Arhab. It was a community that had come together to pool their resources in order to drill a well, and the I don't remember if it's the Emiratis or the Saudis, but had reported that they, after the fact, that they had mistaken it for a TEL, for a transporter erector launcher, the drill. Um, but it was chose to focus on that single strike, both because there was a story beyond just people being victims. It was this community that had come together to do this thing. There was funny people and jealous people and greedy people and kind people, and sort of a they were humans. It wasn't just Muhammad is sad that his family dies. We could sort of build a story about what was going on in this community beforehand, and then of course track the weapon that was used against them. Uh, Getting there was obviously pretty hard. I flew into Aden and then had to travel in disguise up through Yemen, through south up to the sort of midpoint where it splits, and then into North Yemen. One of the people who were sort of ferrying me across the country timed this trip based on the kind of the rhythm. There's this almost circadian rhythm based on cat, based on that's the psychoactive narcotic leaf that everybody there chews, and trying to time it so that we get to the kind of hairiest checkpoints right at the time of day when most people are in the kind of calm, the calm part of their cat cycle.
And
So
is that like that's
managed to,
mid-afternoon?
it's like mid afternoon, yeah. And got through into the north. I was transferred into a second team of fixers and guards, and went all the way up into Sana'a, and stayed in a hotel. It was a really nice hotel that, of course, very few people were in. And then the rest of the way up to Arhab, which I think was like an hour or two further north. One of the interesting things that had happened was um, Ansar Allah, which is sort of the political wing of the Houthis, were obviously in charge in the north. And I had checked 17 million times before leaving to make sure that this village, that they were willing to talk. And when I arrived in Aden, I was told they no longer were, which for a journalist is a sort of tricky thing, because this was, of course, an extremely traumatic thing. You don't really want to compel people to talk if they don't want to. But also, I was a little bit mystified because it seemed like they had been really eager to. And we ended up visiting, once we got to the north, going to the Ansar Allah headquarters there. And what became clear was essentially they were trying to steer me towards a different strike that they thought was sort of more horrific, that would sort of suit their political purposes better. What we ended up doing was kind of finding a way to put them in a position of facilitating the trip to Arhab, so they could sort of still feel like they had some control over what was happening, while still telling the story that we had set out to tell. And when we got there, it turned out the village, of course, they hadn't changed their minds. It had been the political wing of Ansar Allah that had wanted to sort of steer us to a strike that they thought would sort of suit their narrative a little better.
And who had launched the strike?
I was either the Emiratis or the Saudis.
Mm. Because you were there in the middle of the height of this sort of proxy war in Yemen between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and
Right, correct. Yeah. And
which
the
seems to
and
have
the Houthis.
yeah, which seems to have resumed slightly, or maybe resumed and then stopped again.
Hmm.
Um, we have a few questions or comments from the audience, so please feel free to send more of them in the Slido box. From Anonymous, glad that you mentioned Texas Instruments and their defense work. I worked there on their first guided bomb. Texas
Mm.
Instruments had lots of other defense contributions, brackets, radar, infrared, and missiles. So that's just kind of a comment. I don't know if you want to comment
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah, it's sort of. I'm sure the anonymous can speak to this better than I can. But it is an interesting story of how they came to this work. And the kind of company lore is that the predecessor to Texas Instruments started as a essentially an oil prospecting company. They had something called a magnetic anomaly detector that would detect magnetic anomalies under the ground, which would indicate hydrocarbons, and it was sort of ostensibly a better, more efficient way to look for oil. And the company incorporated on something like the day before the Pearl Harbor attack, and so
Uh-huh.
then oil fields were effectively nationalized or whatever. So the company was essentially like inert the moment they incorporated, and that what I was told by some of the people who were Texas Instruments early on was that that kind of founding trauma informed the company's outlook from then on. And there was sort of this idea of we we want to be in tomorrow's market, not today's or yesterday's. And there was this kind of they were kind of hinted to look for things that they might not see a market for yet, but would be kind of an over the horizon potential. And so one of the early kind of visionaries, this guy Pat Haggerty, who had come out of the Navy in World War II, and his narrative was that the U.S. had won the war essentially through technical innovation. So, better proximity fuses that allowed missiles to blow up when they were just close to a Japanese zero or whatever, rather than having to hit it. Better night vision, allowing people on the ships to see. And one of the things he had come across was a thing called a transistor. And Bell Labs had the fundamental patent, but it was being broken up. And so Texas Instruments got a license and started trying to figure out a way to make transistor, instead of out of germanium, out of silicon, which everyone kind of knew would be better if you could figure it out because it's more plentiful. Germanium doesn't work at certain temperatures, but it's a really finicky substance. If there's any impurities, it doesn't work. Everyone kind of thought this would be a material sciences problem for like the Harvard guys or whatever. And Texas Instruments essentially went all in, figuring this could really be a revolutionary product without, I think, knowing what kind of revolution it might precipitate. Um, as they were beginning to put the first silicon-based transistors out, there were a team of former Nazi rocket scientists who, as part of Operation Paperclip, had been moved to Redstone in Alabama to try to modify the Hitler's vengeance weapons to rockets that could actually steer somewhere. Ultimately, that became the Mercury rocket that brought the Apollo mission to the moon, and the Minutemen ICBMs. But for a while, they're having a hard time figuring out how to get these things to land any particular place because Hitler hadn't really been all that concerned with precision. He was trying to like hit London. He didn't need to hit it. So they would send these test rockets up with these clunky vacuum tubes. Every time they sent a test rocket up, they burn up however many of these things, and they needed a better way to create actuators, to create a system that said we're off target this way, move this way. And one of the guys who was kind of managing that team of former Nazi scientists at Redstone came across this silicon semiconductor, I think at an electronics conference, and began purchasing the transistors that Texas Instruments was making to put on the test rockets, kind of replace the vacuum tubes. And that was sort of the first indication, Texas Instruments, that okay, we've got this thing. It's very expensive. If we could bring the cost down, there's probably a consumer market, but we need a customer that isn't concerned about being a first mover, that has money to burn and can buy a bunch of them. Why not the defense? Why not defense applications? And so they sent one of their young engineers down to Air Force Base to try to drum up some work, and that's what ultimately led to Paveway. It's basically the same strategy that led them to put out a handheld calculator. Um, the calculator also for the company was essentially just wrapping paper in order to make the silicon transistor semiconductor easier to sell. So it's a sort of weird thing where like
Hmm.
nerdy high school students and the Air Force are both together essentially trying to bring the cost of semiconductors down to spark what became the personal computing revolution.
Another from Professor Larry Chasteen. The comment is this: Dick Johnson, a glider pilot, came up with a floating head idea. He did the
Correct.
testing in
Yeah.
his swimming pool. I'm not
Yeah.
quite sure what that means, but
Yeah.
you can maybe elucidate.
Yeah. So Dick Johnson, exactly. He was a glider pilot, a test pilot, and he was kind of as he was as taken with the instruments used to measure things as he was the inventions themselves. He was sort of a data nerd. He just loved looking at the data coming off the gliders and the testings. And so he was the one who thought of the Gianni probe rather than the sort of robotic head. When they had their early prototypes of paveway, at the time the space race was in full flower, and it was hard to get wind tunnel time, especially for a company like Texas Instruments, who were kind of the outsiders on the Air Force bases. And so he had the idea of, rather than testing the weapons in a wind tunnel, just making models, putting them in the pool, and dragging them through to test the fluid dynamics. And that's how they tested the so that's essentially what replaced the wind tunnel testing for the early paveways.
And then from Donald Taylor, question: Did your research find anything on Albert Volstetter and the precision munitions
Mm.
projects he worked on, long-range deterrent research and development planning program, and discriminate deterrence?
So no to those questions. There is a somewhere on the cutting room floor, essentially mini biography of Albert Wohlstetter, who I found to be uh, which I'm sure you wouldn't know anything about. Spending
Well,
a lot of time on things that
wasn't he married to Roberta Wolstetter, who wrote the famous Pearl Harbor book?
I think that's right.
Yeah,
And he was sort of the godfather of neocons, so it's sort of
yeah.
relevant to the idea of kind of intervention, um, you know, intervention kind of anywhere. Um, but so yeah, I'm familiar with him. I didn't get deep into any of his work beyond his sort of outlook that I found kind of very informed and humane, but also led to the neocon movement now, and arguably some of the more disastrous interventions more recently.
Um, if if you have a question, please put it in the Slido. Um, so, where do you end your book?
So there's an epilogue. The end of the book before the epilogue is, I guess, spoiler alert, but is the NATO intervention in Libya,
Mm,
um, and end there for a few reasons. One is because that was, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but that was an intervention where um, initially it was thought that simply with air power we would be able to protect the protesters turned rebels from Gaddafi,
yeah.
and also NATO was essentially forbidden by the UN resolution to put troops on the ground. And the intervention, the NATO intervention started and it went very well. But one of the things that the generals found was that you could drive Gaddafi's forces, you could drive regime forces back from a position, but if you can't hold it, they just eventually come back and take it. And because NATO couldn't put really troops on the ground, the natural solution was essentially Libyan emigres living elsewhere and coming back to Libya and being kind of irregular forces. And a lot of them a lot of them were really young. They didn't have training. They didn't have formal experience, and there was, a lot of them were very traumatized by what they saw. So I thought that was kind of symbolic of the idea, not just of there's a sort of evolution of air power can replace troops on the ground, to air power can actually create the need for troops on the ground. And one of the living emigres from Manchester, England, where a lot of them had come from, went back, was radicalized, and ended up bombing the Ariana Grande concert at the Manchester Arena. After which, a photo started making the rounds on social media that the British Royal Air Force confirmed was genuine, and it was a paveway 4 with a with an inscription. Someone had written in marker, "With love from Manchester." And that's sort of how the book ends. The epilogue is one of the character that I follow for uh, for the book that is on the part that's on the Balkans earlier in the book. A young mother who has a radio show who ends up when the airstrikes begin. Her job is essentially to kind of warn people who may not have heard the air raid sirens. Epilogue, we pick her back up. She's moved to Florida, and long story slightly shorter, she ends up taking care of my grandfather who's on his deathbed. So it's a bit of a personal, it's sort of how it comes home to me at the end.
Of course, Obama said his biggest regret was not planning for the day after in Libya. I mean, he basically put together the U.S.-led NATO coalition, which was an air war, which successful at getting rid of Gaddafi. But Libya today is still got two governments and is in a civil war, which has now gone on
Mm-hmm.
for a decade and a half. So
Yeah. Well, and also the largely drone campaign in Iraq and Syria, the anti-ISIS campaign, which in many ways was effective, but at the same time, Libya is sort of collapsing, and oh, ISIS essentially was able to create a safe haven in Libya from which they launched a lot of the foreign attacks.
yeah, and I guess even with the anti-ISIS campaign was successful on some levels, but there were 30,000 of 35,000 American airstrikes in Iraq and Syria during that campaign, just to kind of
Mm-hmm.
it was not. And you look at the city of Mosul, it was basically demolished, which is the second biggest city in Iraq. So, is there a way? Because it does seem that from the U.S. perspective, the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria was pretty successful. There were almost very, very limited American casualties, very large numbers of Iraqi um, and Kurdish casualties, and then also, a huge amount of damage caused by American firepower on some of the cities where ISIS was holed up. Is there like, is there a better way?
I mean, the person I would want to ask that question of is you.
Well, no, I don't. I mean, I don't know because I mean, the air power was necessary and to I mean, it would seem to be necessary to basically defeat ISIS, and but it seems that the United States, after a long period of time, alighted on a set of tactics or strategies with the war against ISIS that it kind of was politically and financially sustainable, which was basically
Hmm.
aligned with the Iraqi counterterrorism service or the largely Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces. And they did all the fighting basically. But it it still involved a lot of American air power.
Hmm. Okay, well, so as I'm groping for a way to not answer this question,
Yeah.
I'll you mentioned the politically and financially sustainable, and that is, I think, a legacy of the first paveway, which um, the narrative is that it was created to solve a tactical and strategic problem, but I think arguably it was really there to create. It really was invented to solve a political problem, which was that the rules of engagement in Vietnam were fairly restrictive. You weren't allowed to strike a MiG on the ground because there might be a Russian or Chinese advisor nearby, and that might escalate things, which meant to to destroy MiGs, you had to bait them up in the air where they were obviously much more dangerous. There's a similar thing trying to hit surface-to-air missile sites. So, arguably there you would have been able to destroy these targets on the ground if you were able to be a little bit if the rules of engagement were a little bit less restrictive. Because they were restrictive, you needed a weapon that you could drop from far away that could hit a precise target, and Paveway came along to solve that problem. So, in a way, the idea that campaign in places like Iraq and Syria and what leads to, as you say, the essential total destruction of Mosul is is a weapon that is as effective at solving a political problem as it is tactical or strategic problem.
And now, of course, 70 to 80% of the fatalities or casualties in the Ukraine-Russian war are caused by drones. So that entire war is now sort of based on kind of what you're writing about in your book.
And then one of the other things, and I don't talk about this in the book, there was an article, I think, in Defense One a few weeks ago about the asymmetry, because it has, of course, gotten much cheaper to launch lethal strikes with drones. I mean, you can modify essentially a consumer drone. There has not been a corresponding, decrease in the price of defense. I mean, a Patriot missile, for example, still costs what a Patriot missile costs. So we're all making it a lot easier to engage in lethal strikes, and we're not really keeping a pace with ways of defending. So that's a bit of an asymmetry that I think is, worrying, and don't know where that ends.
Well, and tanks turn out to be pretty useless in this kind of environment. I mean, I guess there are certain tanks that might be better than others, but um, that's why you see people going into combat on motorbikes, right? I mean, just an effort to get there,
Yeah.
get there in a way that avoids the ubiquitous drones.
Mhm.
So we're now in a situation where the drones are not only, I mean, they can see everything on the battlefield, so there's nowhere to hide, and then they can hunt you down. So when you were doing your reporting for this book, how did you kind of go about it? But were people, I guess, the further back in time, pe the more inclined people are to talk about things, or were there classification issues that were an issue or not?
Yeah, there were. I was really lucky. There were a few people from Texas Instruments. One guy, Steve Romerman, who's just kind of a brilliant, both engineer but also almost educator, and is very dedicated to the history of Texas Instruments, and so was able to explain things. I'm not that technically inclined. Was able to explain things in a way that even I can understand, and hopefully could transmit to the reader in a way that they can understand. But for the narratives, a lot of the people are either not alive, or they're speak a foreign language, or in the case of the part three, which is set in Berlin and is sort of a spy versus spy story. Um, it's both of those things, and it's heavily classified and redacted. So there was a lot of getting people to translate things, trying to figure out what the part that's blocked out is, trying to build a narrative based on breadcrumbs. Then a lot of just individual interviews with people who are still alive, and then I got lucky in some other ways. The first book, which follows a Vietnam pilot, and he had gotten tired of writing letters to his wife. He didn't like writing, and so he went to the machine shop at the base in Thailand that he was stationed at, and had them rig a tape recorder into his intercom, which is of course against regs. But he has this line, like, "What are they going to do? Send me to war?" And so he has these recordings of trying to evade SAM strikes, of trying to attack these very small, well-defended targets, and the first successful deployment of paveway in combat. So I from having audio of what was going on, I'm able to create a narrative with the conversation that's happening in the cockpit, just because Lieutenant Colonel Rick Hilton thought to record his conversations, and then was generous enough to share it with me.
That's great. And I mean, what sort of records are in the public domain now? Or did you use FOIA, or um, was there already documents that have been FOIA'd by other organizations, or was there stuff that's just been declassified because of time?
Yeah, it's all of the above. I didn't do a lot of FOIAing myself,
Yeah.
um, but there's like RAND reports that are declassified now about the invention of the weapon, about some of the early uses. So everything from even just the secondary sources to news articles, down to interviews with generals, down to RAND reports, down to declassified government reports, and for the parts that have to do with the Reagan administration, a lot there's redacted, but there's minutes of a lot of the meetings from the National Security Council. So able to kind of recreate some of those conversations. And then as we get further in time, so for example, the Second Iraq War, um, the main character in the narrative of the Second Iraq War is a guy named Luis Rueda, who was the director of the Iraq Operations Group for the CIA, and he and I had a whole lot of conversations. And then there's Bob Woodward reporting, and there's people who've written autobiographies, and of course, depending on when those things came out, some of the names are changed. So then there's the sort of the dance of trying to figure out, is this person or is this person, and trying to cross reference in order to sort of take as much from these different sources so you can build a narrative. So the short answer is I stole from everywhere to try and put this story together.
Um, so from Professor Larafi, what about international humanitarian law? Is that not the best guardrail instead of idealizing the warheads? Thanks.
Mm, yeah, but I suppose I the 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 argument for paveway for precision munitions is just extremely powerful, um, even down to the sale of them, because they're typically union jobs, they're security clearance jobs that can't be outsourced. This is not the case with paveway in particular, but of course, there's the concept of geographic engineering, where you try to have part of the weapon built in as many different congressional districts as possible, which makes them even harder to cancel. Um, you can argue that not only should we be using these things, we should be exporting them, because wouldn't we rather have a seat at the table when other countries are making decisions to strike, so we can make sure they're doing them more humanely? Wouldn't we rather be closer to those countries? Wouldn't we rather they not instead purchase these weapons from China or Russia? So the effect of all of that is, I think, a lot of civilian casualties, a lot of inhumanity, but it is such a powerful argument that I think it's very hard to say, let's just respect international humanitarian law. Of course, we should, when you have such a powerful 360-degree kind of ecosystem that is pushing for these things to be built, used, and exported.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same set of arguments around armed drones, which, as we already discussed, were only first used after 9/11 by the United States, and we had a monopoly on that technology, which, surprise, surprise, we don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly, armed drone is more discriminatory than a dumb bomb or even a smart bomb, because you can loiter over a target for hours,
Mm-hmm.
distinguish potentially between civilians and combatants. You can build up a
Mm-hmm.
pattern of life of the targets that you're acquiring. I mean, look at the Ayman al-Zawahiri strike in downtown Kabul in 2022. It went straight into the room in which he was, you know, waking up in the morning at 6 a.m. or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
killed only him, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's the same set of arguments, but it allows warfare. The boundaries between war and peace get a lot fuzzier when you have these more accurate weapons on some levels, because obviously, you know, there's no president today that would order a B-52 strike in downtown Kabul, the
Mm-hmm.
city of 6 million people, to try and kill Ayman al-Zawahiri. It's not going to happen because you'd have so many civilian casualties. So it's the same set of arguments. I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong. Um, but clearly there's a book by Samuel Moyn. I think he's a philosopher. I don't know if you've read it. I haven't read it, but it's got basically the idea that by having more humane, quote unquote, warfare, we've made it easier to go to war, including international humanitarian law, by the way, I think is part of his argument.
Mm-hmm. I think it's like an interesting sort of thought exercise. And you raised this earlier. World War II, we firebombed Dresden. Obviously, there was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If we didn't have precision weapons, uh, the calculus would be, okay, we are going to kill a lot of civilians. Is it worth it?
Yeah.
And now we're able to say, often correctly, sometimes incorrectly, we're not going to kill civilian casualties. So we're not going to create a lot of civilian casualties. So we can do this. Um, and does the capability sort of allow more suffering than if we didn't have it? And we had to sort of consciously say, we're going to destroy an entire city because we think it's worth it.
This is a comment which is related to that from Professor Larry Chasteen. Thanks for tying the pathway to better ways of fighting wars. I was a B-52 pilot in the Vietnam War. Kind of,
Mm,
guess at the same point
hmm.
you were making. Um, yeah, well, so see if there's any other questions here from the audience. And this, if not, we will encourage the audience to purchase the book, which they can do on screen.
Hmm.
And we wish you very good luck with your book tour, Jeff. The book is The Warhead, The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare. And we're very grateful that you came and gave us some of the headlines from the book.
Peter, thank you so much, and thanks for all your support going back like 2 decades now.
Uh,
Really appreciate it, and I'm doing this crazy thing because of your uh, your mentorship early on.
oh, well, that's very kind. And thanks to the audience for tuning in. Okay, take care. Bye.